be made up in many different ways.
It's called SOGI, for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identification, a curriculum that teaches public school students across Canada to celebrate the homosexual lifestyle and that gender is fluid. In other words, your gender is not dependent on what parts you were born with, but rather what you feel like in the moment.
There's people that are boys, there's people that are girls, there are people whose gender might be a little bit of both, or might even be neither.
Lessons include books about transgender children.
The origin of trans ideology, manufactured madness, and the architects of gender chaos. It didn't emerge from some natural progression of human understanding. It wasn't the product of scientific discovery or philosophical enlightenment. The ideology of gender fluidity, non-binary identities, and the erasure of biological sex didn't rise. It was constructed. Built in the laboratories of elite academia, funded by globalist institutions, and injected into the bloodstream of Western culture like a slow-drip poison. The intellectual blueprint came from Judith Butler, an obscure Yale-trained philosopher whose 1990 book, Gender Trouble, became the spark for the wildfire. She wasn't just another radical thinker. She was the perfect ideological vessel for a much bigger game. Butler's philosophy wasn't about liberation. It was about deconstruction, the deliberate dismantling of man and woman as categories, the erasure of gender norms, the obliteration of stability itself. Her central claim? Gender isn't real, it's a performance. A role assigned by society, forced upon us, not tied to any biological reality. And if gender is just a construct, then the next logical step is to abolish it entirely. What began as gender studies metastasized into queer theory, a movement hell-bent on disrupting anything considered normal. The goal was never equality. It was subversion, confusion, and permanent instability. But an ideology doesn't spread on its own. It needs funding, enforcement, a network of institutions willing to reshape the world. That's where the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Interests, and George Soros's Open Society Foundation entered the picture. These globalist financiers saw something in Butler's theories. A tool to break down traditional family structures, to destabilize the cultural bedrock of the West, to create a generation adrift in self-doubt and confusion. The pipeline was set. 1. Elite universities, like Yale, Berkeley, and Harvard, made gender theory the new gospel. 2. NGOs and think tanks spread it into media, government, and corporate HR departments. 3. Public schools and children's programming became the battleground for the next generation. It was slow at first. The 90s and early 2000s were a time of laying foundations, academic indoctrination, legal lobbying, corporate compliance. Then, after gay marriage was won in 2015, the movement needed a new frontier to keep the machine running. The focus shifted to transgenderism. Almost overnight, the trans identity went from fringe to sacred. Gender dysphoria, once treated as a psychological disorder, was rebranded as a natural and untouchable identity. Corporations, social media giants, and activist organizations poured billions into normalizing gender fluidity, pushing pronoun mandates, and fast-tracking children into hormone treatments. Then came the real enforcement. ESG, environmental, social, and governance scores, forced corporations to embrace gender ideology or face financial punishment. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Policies made gender ideology a workplace requirement. School policies encouraged gender transitions behind parents' backs. Social media banned anyone questioning the narrative. The final frontier was medicine. The trans industry became a multi-billion-dollar machine, fueled by pharmaceutical companies eager to create lifelong medical patients. Puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, double mastectomies on teenage girls, all marketed as gender-affirming care. Doctors who refused to comply were blacklisted, parents who objected were labeled abusive, children who questioned were given a one-way ticket to permanent medicalization. This was not progress. This was not liberation. This was a deliberate ideological assault designed to unmake human identity itself. It was never about acceptance. It was about redefining reality, creating a society where truth is fluid, where biology is secondary to ideology, where people become so disconnected from themselves that they rely on the system for every aspect of their existence. Trans ideology didn't come from the people. It didn't emerge organically. It was manufactured by elite academics, global financiers, and corporate overlords who saw a new way to break, remold, and control civilization. The blueprint was written, the system activated, and now the world is drowning in its consequences.